It's Thursday, it's 9:15 and we're live in Westminster. Another early start, particularly after last night's football. I'm joined by Conservative MP and Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Tom Tugendhat, Labour MP and former Foreign Secretary Margaret Beckett, the political editor of The Sun, Harry Cole, and political editor of Galdem magazine, Moya Lothian-McLean. Today, as we emerge from the pandemic, Chancellor Rishi Sunak has some big decisions ahead. Is one of them a plan to ditch the pensions triple lock?
I do recognise people's concerns on this. I think they are completely legitimate and fair concerns to raise.
Also today,
I must say that I'm instinctively and always have been against sporting boycotts.
the Prime Minister is urged to take a tough stance over China, over human rights abuses. Will he?
Can I also extend a special welcome to the new member for Batley and Spen?
After a narrow by-election win, is Labour on the up? And England head to the final on Sunday, so should Monday be a bank holiday? So joy following England's victory last night over Denmark. Let's have a look at some of the papers and their front pages. Here is The Sun, 3 Lions roar into final. Probably the best feeling in the world. This is the headline in the Daily Mirror. After 55 years of hurt, finally. And let's take a look at the Times. England make history. Well, amidst the excitement, of course, there are now reports over how best to celebrate a potential England victory on Sunday night in the final. One idea being actively considered, apparently, is a bank holiday, as we mentioned in the headlines on Monday, as people obviously feel no one will make it to work. A good idea or not, Tom?
Well, I think it's likely to happen anyway. So it's one of those moments where I think the government should just recognise what's going to be going on anyway. Right.
So you think it should be a bank holiday if they win?
Well, I'd be very supportive.
Margaret, what about you?
Do you mean just declare a bank holiday immediately? I'm not sure how practical that is. I'm not against it. I take the point entirely. People won't go anyway.
Well, Harry?
I think we're counting chickens here. Can we just stop all of this? Too much.
What was that, Margaret?
I so agree. I hate it. Talk about tempting providence.
Yes, well, as you say, there might have been rather too much excitement, perhaps, ahead of the match. Moya, what about you?
Well, I mean, I think we should wait and see how many people actually turn up for work and then, retrospectively, declare whether it's a bank holiday or not.
Have you already investigated the idea, Moya?
I have already inquired about whether it could be a half day. My request was denied. So if my boss is watching, this is another chance.
Well, what I can tell you is that Politics Live will be here on Monday, whatever happens, at 12:15 at the slightly later time. I want to also point you in the direction of this story, though, in the Sun newspaper. This is about the COVID NHS app. It says, The Sun says, is it any wonder huge numbers of Brits are deleting the NHS COVID app? Harry, take us through the story.
Yeah, so very concerns in the Department of Health overnight in the last sort of 96 hours, really, that the number of people, because cases are going up, the number of people getting pinged by the NHS app, which we should remember is not like being contacted by Test and Trace. It is advisory. It is, you're asked to self-isolate. You're not legally obliged to do so. But concern within Whitehall over the last few days that a number of people appear to be turning off the contact tracing element of the app, the bit that sort of whether you've come into contact with a COVID sufferer for a number of minutes, you get an alert telling you to isolate for 10 days. It seems that Brits are unilaterally deciding they've enough is enough on that one.
Right. Well, Margaret, what's your reaction? Do you think it was a mistake by Sajid Javid to delay the change in self-isolation rules until August the 16th?
Yes, I think it might have been. I think I sympathise totally with the fact the government's trying to get this right, but I'm not sure they are getting right in terms of the timing and the approach and so on. And I think they're at a risk of causing a fresh panic.
Right. What would you suggest if it was Labour?
I would suggest, as as Keir and Jonathan were saying yesterday, that what we take is a measured approach. Don't just say, OK, it's all over, throw all the precautions out of the window, nobody bother. Oh, well, except, of course, if you don't bother and then you get it, then it'll be your fault. It's your responsibility. I think the whole tone of that is just not sensible.
Tom?
I think the time's come to trust the British people, and one of the things that I've noticed over the last 2 years is the number of people who have been making extremely reasonable decisions. A lot of people have had to take difficult decisions about contact with family, contact with friends, how to get to work and so on. And I think people, by and large, have made very sensible decisions, and so I'm quite comfortable with trusting the people of this country.
Right, so you do think it was a mistake by Sajid Javid to delay in terms of people who are double jabbed having to self-isolate if they come into contact with people who test positive?
I get what Sajid is trying to do, and I respect the fact that he's trying to do a graduated timeline down, but I think it's time for us to trust the British people. Most people are now vaccinated. Certainly everybody in the top 9 groups, the most at-risk groups who has wanted a vaccination has now got one. So I think it's really time to trust the British people. Although,
Moya, some of the statistics around this indicated that there would be 25% fewer people infected with the virus by delaying by 4 weeks.
I mean, I'm not part of the government scientific team or SAGE, so I don't really feel like I can comment as much on that aspect. But in regards to the app, I think that perhaps people would be less likely to delete it or ignore it if there was more clearer communication around the fact that it's advisory, and also if there was more transparency about who you'd come into contact with. For example, if you get pinged, it doesn't say who, you could be in a pub and the entire pub will get pinged. And it's doing some real damage to the hospitality industry. I know even anecdotally of lots of people who've had to, like staff at last minute, have had to self-isolate. And I do think there needs to be a review of how the app is actually used, but also if they just communicated that this is an advisory measure and it takes for track and trace to directly contact you in order to, when you're required to self-isolate, perhaps then people would be more likely to keep using it, because I know it has prevented at least 600,000 to 1 million cases according to the stats that came out of it. So it's obviously been a force for good, but it's just a reconsidering how we use it now and being flexible in our approach, the same way we've been doing throughout the pandemic.
Tom?
I think time and again people have demonstrated that they can act responsibly and have done so. I think there's an awful lot of people who have used the app extremely sensibly, and the check-in function and things like that has been extremely useful. So I don't criticise it, but I think Sajid has got the right message now, which is he's the health secretary, not just the COVID secretary, and there are a lot of other sadly medical conditions that have been put on the back burner, as it were, rather than when they need a lot of focus. I mean,
one of the criticisms, Harry, was about self-isolation payments, the government being criticised for not being more forthcoming over that. Has that made a difference?
Yeah, this is obviously, Keir Starmer's big favourite line, go-to line. And actually, it's really interesting in that seems to be one of the very few things, that and masks, stronger guidance on masks, really is all that Labour will attack the government on. There's absolute cigarette paper between the two of them, which I thought was really interesting. Time and again yesterday at PMQs, Keir Starmer had the opportunity to distance himself from the roadmap, to object to the timings, to object to relaxing travel rules for red list, for amber list countries, for double jabbed people, and they noticeably didn't. So if after 18 months of this pandemic, the dividing line between the opposition and the government appears to be only on a couple of quite minor issues, really, in the grand scale of things, it's phenomenal, really, that this sort of consensus is still holding.
Margaret?
Well, there are rather a lot of other dividing lines, Harry. I mean, they're not current at the moment, but a whole lot of stuff about procurement.
On the pandemic, specifically on COVID.
Well, I'm talking about COVID as well. There's a lot of criticism about procurement, about the handling, about the timing of decisions, about the timing even now of why the border wasn't closed to flights from India before we got the Indian variant. There are many, many differences. But on the precise narrow point of what we do at this moment about the precautions people are taking, yes, there is a recognition of the attempt to try and strike the right balance, but a criticism, not for the first time, of the way the government's going about it.
Harry?
Yeah, but actually it's all quite retrospective, isn't it? It's all looking backwards. If Keir Starmer genuinely objected to, say, lifting restrictions on the 19th of July, as it appears likely that the ministers are going to sign off on Monday. He could come out against it, but actually it's fairly minor quibbling on what is a phenomenal scale. And yes, there's rows about procurement and things like that. It's all looking backwards, though. If the opposition actually wanted to oppose the lifting of restrictions, they would be making a lot more noise than they are now.
All right, I'm going to just, before we move on, bring you this breaking news, which is that Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, has been cleared of breaking Commons rules over the £15,000 Mustique freebie holiday, as the headline describes it in the Daily Mail with Carrie, despite Sleaze watchdog criticising unusual arrangements and saying Prime Minister didn't know how the trip was being funded. Harry, your response?
Lucky General strikes again, isn't it? They keep throwing every possible sort of tool in the armoury, really. We lose count how many different sleaze probes and watchdog investigations this government appear to be under. But the Teflon Prime Minister has a sneaky habit of getting away with these things. There's the lightest of taps on the wrists from the Standards Committee, suggesting that this was an unusual arrangement, and given Mr. Johnson's sort of past breaches of the sort of sleaze rules, where you have to sort of declare outside earnings. He got into trouble a couple of years ago for sort of failing to declare all his various book earnings and things like that within the 28-day time limit. So they said he should have gone above and beyond, but sighs of relief in Downing Street, because this one, from an outsider's perspective, looked like it could have been tricky. But once again, he's got away with it.
We're going to talk about a report by the Institute for Fiscal Studies. They've just published a report into living standards, poverty and inequality in the UK, looking at household incomes. We have the IFS Director, Paul Johnson, with us. Welcome to Politics Live. First of all, though, the confirmation by the Chancellor today about phasing out the weekly £20 increase in universal credit. It was announced by the Work and Pensions Secretary yesterday in committee. What impact is that going to have, do you think, on families later on this year if inflation goes up?
Well, clearly, a lot of families, millions, and let's not forget universal credit is something that is received by millions of families. This is not a small thing, and indeed, perhaps up to a quarter of the working age population are entitled to some universal credit. They will just lose £20 a week, and particularly for those who are childless, this is a very large fraction of their total income. So if you're out of work and childless, you're probably only getting about £80 a week, and for that to be cut by 20 clearly has an enormous effect on your living standards. Now, the Chancellor would perfectly reasonably say, well, look, this was only ever intended to be a temporary increase to cover us through the pandemic. By September, we'll be back to something approaching normal, and I really don't want to be caught out promising temporary increases and those always turning out to be permanent. But it will be a big shock for people who've got used to what has been a really significant increase in their benefit levels.
What about the main findings of the report, Paul?
Well, mostly good news, I think, is the key to what we were doing. We've been looking at what's happened to living standards over the last year, and despite what's clearly been the biggest a recession pretty much in history and a huge economic dislocation, the combination of these things, like the increase in universal credit, but particularly the furlough scheme and the self-employment support scheme and so on, have meant that we really don't see any increase over the last year in deprivation or poverty or people being behind on bills or use of food banks or anything like that. So across the population, a remarkable degree of stability in incomes, despite this awful year that we've had. Now, there are some groups who have suffered. I mean, interestingly and worryingly, some ethnic minority groups have done particularly badly, particularly among Pakistani and Bangladeshi, those from Pakistani and Bangladeshi backgrounds, partly because just one of them losing their jobs, often they're supporting significant households. Quite a lot of them are in particular parts of the economy that have suffered. And another group, and this is overlapping, is that some of the self-employed have done particularly badly, because the self-employed income support scheme has not supported all of them in the way that the furlough scheme really has supported employees.
Right. What about some of the big decisions that are going to have to be made by Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor? Because, of course, the spending taps have been on during the pandemic, and now perhaps universal credit underlines some of the decisions. I know, obviously, this was temporary, that he's going to have to make. What are they, Paul?
Yes, well, there are some really big choices ahead. I mean, if you look at in the detail of the budget numbers from back in March, he's proposing that there'll be literally no additional spending next year to reflect any additional costs associated with COVID. So no extra money for health or education or transport or local government or social care or whatever relative to what he was planning pre-pandemic. Now, that seems pretty implausible. We know that there's huge pressures on the health service and all of those other bits of public services. So he's going to have to find, I think, some significant additional amount of money. Now, he might be somewhat bailed out by the fact that the economy does look like it's doing better than he thought back in March, and that might provide him with some additional resources. But he's still going to have a really tough spending review, given that all of government departments are going to be there asking for more money.
All right. Please stay with us for the discussion. I mean, let's go back to universal credit and that decision, Tom. Stephen Timms, the Labour chair of the Work and Pensions Committee, has said it could push 500,000 people below the poverty line. What's the justification for that?
Well, I think one of the things that you've got to factor in at the same time is that the living wage has gone up an extra £350 a year, and actually we're seeing wage inflation in the UK at the moment. One of the things that has been a remarkable achievement, and Paul mentioned it just then, is that actually the jobless figures haven't gone up significantly. We've managed to maintain many, many more jobs than we were expecting. Sorry, not as significantly as was expected, is what I meant to say. We've managed to maintain many, many more jobs and many more ongoing businesses than we expected at the beginning of this pandemic. And that is a huge success. Now, I'm not going to tell you that there's nothing more to be done. There is, of course there is. But that is a huge success.
Margaret?
I think we have undoubtedly been fortunate so far, and I'm pleased to hear what Paul says from the point of view of the individuals involved about people's standard of living being maintained. But there are those groups, and he identified the self-employed, they are one, who really are very vulnerable. And I do think it is really reckless to make such a big cut in the levels of... I understand totally the wish of a chancellor not to, as was said, to see something that was put in as a temporary uplift, described as that in the context of the pandemic, then suddenly turn into something permanent. But while that's the conventional wisdom, if you like, I really do think the levels of universal credit and the overall impact of the way the benefit system works is so harsh. I think the Chancellor is playing with fire.
Playing with fire and reckless, Tom.
Well, I wouldn't say so. I mean, I think one of the things that's characterised Rishi Sunak over this last year, 18 months really, is the extreme caution with which he's treated people's businesses, people's lives, and the way he's really put as much of a protective wrapper around many people as he possibly can. Now, I'm not going to tell you there aren't a few groups that, like some self-employed people who I think have been wrongly excluded, and I'd like to see changes in that. But the reality is he has gone above and beyond, and he's done exactly what he said he'd do at the beginning of the COVID crisis and try to protect as many as possible.
Moya?
Just doesn't make sense to me. These are real people who are struggling, and we're talking about, 500,000 people. I read an estimate it could be up to 700,000 who've been being pushed below the breadline by the £20 uplift. We don't know yet what the economic outcome of the pandemic is going to be. The furlough scheme has more people on it currently than there was predicted originally. I think it's 2.4 million. We're looking at a summer of isolation and apps pinging and people not being able to go to work. Sick pay is still not up. And to take away £20 a week from, 500,000 families, and young people especially, because it's 2/3 of unemployed currently who are 16 to 24 years old, to take that away from them, it's just heartless. And I don't think we can sit here. I heard Rishi Sunak saying they'd thrown the kitchen sink at making sure people weren't pushed into poverty. Well, the kitchen sink isn't enough. So more needs to be done. And doing this right now based on data, as I think a Tory MP pointed out, that they're taking away the uplift based on data from March, when we haven't got the data for what it's going to look like in October, just seems absolutely foolish and heartless to me. But
Tom, I mean, 6 former welfare secretaries also agree.
Well, I know, and they've made their case very clearly, and what I'm waiting to do is to see what comes up in the spending decision when it comes up in September. I think it's a little early to say it's heartless when a decision hasn't actually yet been taken, and so I think that we need to wait and see what the fiscal events are. The reality is...
That is the decision now, isn't it? We know it's going to be phased out.
That is the current suggestion, yes, but the reality is...
It's not a suggestion, it's the decision.
the reality is that the government is spending an awful lot of our money. This isn't the government's money that's somehow magicked out. This is our money that is going to have to be paid back by generations to come.
Right. And is this the first, Harry, of a series of what could be very unpopular decisions, not just with the opposition and voters who will experience hardship as a result, but also within the party itself, the Tory party itself?
Absolutely. This is going to. The spending review is going to make this look like a tea party. This is a minor skirmish on the fringe of it, but it's very easy to say £20 uplift. £20 uplift, it's just £20. You add that up, it's £6 billion a year. That is a big chunk that the Chancellor needs to find. But also, the problem with this one is it's quite politically toxic because, as Tom or Margaret, I think said, a lot of these claimants are in work. These are the people that Universal Credit is topping up their salary. These people haven't been on furlough for a year. They haven't been at home. These are the delivery drivers. These are the supermarket workers. These are the people who have kept the economy going for the last year. And the problem is, it feels like another kick in the teeth that they haven't had the protection of furlough. They haven't had, they haven't been paid to stay at home. They've had their salaries topped up to allow others to stay at home and have have Amazon Prime deliveries and supermarket deliveries day in, day out. So it does feel very unfair that actually these are the people that are going to be made to bear the brunt when a lot of other people have had it relatively, it's been awful, and I don't for a moment, wouldn't wish it on the world, but, have been protected, have been paid to stay at home. And I just think it's a very toxic one for the Tories to get into because, the great pivot that the party have done to try and become the party of the working class, quite successfully so far in terms of 2019 and things. These are the voters that backed them, and it feels a little bit like they're going to get punished.
Paul, can we talk a little bit about the spending review, the big decisions that Rishi Sunak is going to have to make? How important is that staging post going to be in terms of not choking off any growth?
Well, this is going to be one of the most important non-COVID related parts of this entire Parliament. He's really going to have to lay out his stall in terms of how much austerity, how much extra spending, and how that relates to the economy as well as the public services. Now, in terms of the way the economy is going, things are at the moment going, it seems, extraordinarily well, at least for large parts of the economy. I think he's actually going to want to be careful on both margins here. Too much stimulus alongside the massive stimulus that we've got from the Bank of England and the risks that do exist on the inflationary side could actually push the bank to be increasing interest rates and itself do harm. Most of the forecasts that we have suggest that, astonishingly, the economy is running or soon will be running at something close to its capacity. So we're not, over the next couple of years, it seems, in a world where you need the sorts of fiscal stimulus to get the economy running in the way that perhaps we did back in 2010. So I don't think that that's going to be at the centre of his overall spending choices. Now, some parts will be. He's going to be thinking very hard about young people and unemployment. He really needs to be ensuring that those who have been long-term unemployed are getting support, that training and apprenticeships and so on are well supported, and that we're in a position to support those who are, as the economy probably adapts, some more home working, perhaps less activity in city centres and so on, that the economy adapts to a new normal. But I don't think at the centre of his calculations are going to be, I need to spend X in order to keep the economy going. It's going to be much more micro decisions.
And Paul mentions focus on young people and jobs for young people. Tom, one of the things we've discussed on the programme, and in fact Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, has answered on this, indicating that perhaps the triple lock on pensions, which was a manifesto commitment by the Conservatives, could be looked at. He says he understands the legitimate concerns of many of your colleagues over that triple lock. Should it go?
Well, I think what he's got to do is he's got to balance the different generations here. Now, he's introduced the Kickstarter scheme. He's been very, very focused on getting people into training, into apprenticeships, into jobs as early as possible. And that will require some form of balance. Now, exactly how he's going to balance it, I'm going to need to talk to him about what the other options are on the table. I don't sit in his Treasury office, and I don't see all the
So you'd like to stick
balancing.
to the triple lock?
Well, in principle, I'd like to stick to our manifesto pledges. It is one of those things that I think we should do.
Right. Margaret, what about you? Again, we've had Labour MPs also saying the same thing. Perhaps this is the time that it needs to be looked at, that guarantee of increase in the state pension.
I think you have got to look at the whole picture. Because there is still a lot of pensioner poverty. There was an item earlier on this morning, I think on the Today programme, about how our pension still is one of the smallest in Europe, if not in the world. So I think you've got to be cautious about that. But on the other hand, there isn't any doubt that it's the young we have to be particularly concerned about. And, you know, the rhetoric about Kickstart and some of the other programmes is excellent. I think the reality maybe isn't quite so successful. And that's something we need to keep a careful eye on and make sure that actually we're not just saying how much we want to help the young, but that it is having practical success.
Right.
Right. We are seeing a lot of people going into apprenticeships and training at the moment, and those schemes are actually delivering real opportunities for young people today.
Moya?
Oh, I was reading recently a report from a youth education charity that said it would take about 1,000 job places and training places a day in order to get back to the level of like employment and young people in training that were pre-pandemic. So I think unless we're seeing that, then we'll need a massive upscaling of initiatives to get young people into work and into education, into employment, and more vocational training as well. Schemes that we're talking about apprenticeships and training. One of the problems at the moment is a lot of young people get mired in higher education with large amounts of debt and no guarantee of a job at the end. We need training schemes, we need vocations, and I think that's a real concern. As I said before, 2/3 of young people are currently make up the unemployment figures. So that's something that's really troubling to me, and I think we need to stop pitting the old and the young against each other. We need to look at poverty across these two groups and how we can tackle it holistically.
I'm going to say goodbye to Paul Johnson. Thank you very much for joining us. Just briefly, though, Harry, before we move on, again, this is going to be a difficult issue, isn't it, on the triple lock of pensions for the Conservatives?
Absolutely, and Rishi Sunak knows what he's doing. I suggest, my gut instinct says the fact he's going on the radio on the 8:10 on the Today programme talking about this openly means he hasn't won this argument with Boris Johnson yet, and it feels to me like he's decided to take his lobbying, which he's doing behind the scenes, to say, look, I've got my hands tied here. You know, I can't put up income tax because that's a manifesto problem. I can't cut aid, which is, you know, for a long term because that's a manifesto problem. Promise. You know, what can I do to fix this? I need a bit of freedom to be able to do things. So the fact he's gone public with these pleas makes me think he's perhaps not winning that battle yet. So it'd be really interesting to see how that plays out. But just on reality, just a quick one. I mean, not pitting young people against each other versus old people, but just, you know, just think about what young people have gone through. They're still waiting for their jabs, lots of them. You know, they're going to watch older generations be able to jet off on holiday this year. You know, and then you're asking them for an 8% pay rise, essentially, in terms of the state pension, to be paid for by the very same young people who really have suffered, given up so much to protect the elderly in the last year, to then for them to be the ones that have to pay for a state pension increase. I think, you know, what planet are these people on?
We'll leave it there because we're going to talk about China because the Foreign Affairs Committee, which Tom chairs, our guest here, is calling for a diplomatic boycott of the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics. Tom, what is a diplomatic boycott?
Well, it means no ministers, no officials, no members of the royal family going to the event.
But the athletes go.
The athletes go, but it's as low-key as possible. So instead of having a full athletes parade, you have, as we did in various other Olympics in the past, just a single person holding the flag for the parade, and that's it. So it's really about as low-key as you can get while still complying with the Olympics rules.
Why?
Well, because this is a state that Parliament has voted is committing genocide in its western province of Xinjiang. This is a state that we've seen repress democracy in Hong Kong in direct violation of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. And we know, of course, historically about the violations against the Tibetan people and now, more recently, the Mongol people inside China's borders.
And what would it achieve?
Well, it at least makes the point that China cannot get a propaganda coup from the fact that everybody seems to think it's OK. It's not OK. And Britain, and I'm sure others, would be making the point very clearly that we are extremely disappointed with what we're seeing and we're prepared to act.
Margaret, are you signed up to this?
I think it's a very sensible set of ideas. I mean, I think one of the things that how do you get across a message through the control that the Chinese government has over their people? So, for example, one reads that most of the population, especially among the young, have never heard of the Tiananmen Square massacre and of all the events around there. So how do you get a message through? And so it's got to be something simple and blunt, and making people ask, why is that happening? Why is there only one athlete representing? If that's one of the things that's decided to do. Why is there only one athlete marching with the British flag? To get people to ask those questions is one of the few ways in which you can actually prod into a regime like that.
Margaret, Labour have come up with a similar set of proposals, political and diplomatic boycott of the Games in the way that you have described. Do you think it will actually happen?
The boycott or the Games?
Yes, no, the boycott.
Yes, I think it probably will. I don't see why it would not.
Right. I mean,
I haven't heard massive arguments against it, I must admit, but maybe I've missed them.
Well, except, of course, Boris Johnson.
No, he didn't. He said he was against a sporting boycott, which is the athletes. We're not arguing for a sporting boycott.
So have you got him on board on this, then?
I haven't got any promises from him, but I asked him about this in the liaison committee, I think, just before Christmas, I think it was, and I wouldn't be at all surprised to find that he agrees.
Right, but do you think he really would sign up to the idea of British athletes not being able to participate in the Games opening or closing ceremonies beyond one representative carrying a union flag? I mean, is it fair to ask athletes to participate in a political boycott of that kind?
I think it's perfectly reasonable to ask athletes to participate in the events that they've trained all their lives for, but not to participate in those elements which are propaganda.
Harry?
Yeah, just to say, there's a very recent precedent for this, which is the fact that no ministers, no royals went to the 2018 World Cup. Sorry, no, the Prime Minister didn't go. I think they sent a very junior minister in a similar vein. So they are open to this idea. It was in the wake of the Salisbury poisoning, the idea that, we were going to go with bells and whistles to Russia, was too much to call. I would just make one point, though. I wrote a story just before Christmas that this was being discussed. In Whitehall and in Downing Street, and I have to say, they went absolutely crackers at me with that story. They had the Chinese embassy onto them within minutes. The people I was speaking to, my sources, came under quite heavy fire for that story, which just goes to show how much it would hurt the Chinese. It's clear that they are desperate for this not to happen, and if there's ever a year to poke them in the eye on the diplomatic stage, surely this is it.
Right,
after all.
Well, but Tom, earlier this year, the Prime Minister described himself as fervently Sinophile and determined to improve ties, whatever the occasional political difficulties. What do you make of those comments?
Well, I think you can be Sinophile and still extremely cautious about the communist government on the grounds that the Chinese people and the communist state are not the same thing. Yes, I am. I would describe myself as a Sinophile. It's a fantastic civilization, 5,000 years of amazing human advancement, now currently under the despotic rule of a bunch of geriatrics.
Right. Well, I mean, Margaret, the Prime Minister's also warned against an anti-China spirit scaring away investment in the UK. What do you make of that?
I have long been very nervous about the way in which, under David Cameron and George Osborne, we frankly crawled to China for investment, which I was very dubious about. So if there's more caution about investment from China, I understand the concerns, I understand the nervousness, but it's welcome.
Right, but have previous Labour governments not done the same as what you just described David Cameron and George Osborne doing in trying to improve relations with China?
No, I think every government tries to improve relations, but there was a sort of overdone enthusiasm about, we're China's best friend, and you kind of think, no, it was OTT, and I thought unwise.
Right. Well, I mean, what was your stance when you were Foreign Secretary?
Oh, I mean, we did try and improve relations with China. We did welcome better relations with China. But I have to say, at that time, many people thought, all the China experts thought, that China was warming, was opening up, that things were going to improve in China. I went and spoke to the party school, and it was all about China opening up to greater democracy. There was a very different atmosphere in China then, which sadly has now very much been clamped down on.
Right. Was it a mistake, though, Tom? I mean, Margaret says it was at different times and perhaps there was a sort of warmer indication coming from China in terms of opening up. But was it a mistake of previous governments to roll out the red carpet as they did, particularly David Cameron and George Osborne?
Well, I think with hindsight, you can say that the mistake was really Bill Clinton's mistake to allow China into the World Trade Organization in 2000, at a time when actually we thought that the standards that we shared at the WTO would liberalise, open up China and free the Chinese people in many ways in the way that it worked in many other countries. Now, actually, it turns out we were all wrong, and we now need to respond to the fact that we have a very, very dominant economy that is increasingly using its leverage to try and change the norms and undermine our freedoms, and I think we need to respond to that.
All right, we'll talk about something else, and that is the new MP for Batley and Spen, the new Labour MP, Kim Leadbeater, was sworn in earlier this week. We can probably show you some pictures of Keir Starmer and her together there. Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, saying she's looking delighted. Keir Starmer saying that Labour is back. Moya, you have described Keir Starmer as a wet wipe in the past, a little while ago, and perhaps more recently, in the wake of the Hartlepool by-election, which Labour lost. You did ask, what is the point of Keir Starmer? There is the Galdem headline. Keir Starmer is a wet wipe. Why?
Why Keir Starmer is a wet wipe? I think this is an opinion that I had in December 2020 and I still hold now, and I think it's becoming more prevalent among the people who are watching politics, that Keir Starmer is someone who and we talked about this earlier when we were talking about the opposition, there doesn't seem to be any opposing in a substantial form, and also we don't know what he stands for yet. Obviously, Labour have argued it's hard to make policy in a pandemic. Well, the way that they've opposed the government or not opposed the government throughout, when there's been multiple occasions, I think is very telling itself, and I think Keir Starmer has failed to carve out who he is, what he stands for, and any sort of fight or fire that he promised. He has also not unified the party in the way that he promised to, and on the mandate he was elected on in the first place. And I think the celebrations around Batley and Spen, the fact that the margin was only 323 votes is nothing to celebrate at all. And what the damage that was done to Muslim voters during that election, I think there's been a drop of about 11% in support, according to, I think, the Labour Muslim Network, from the Muslim demographic. It just keeps going onwards. You learned yesterday that Trevor Phillips had been quietly reinstated to the party after his suspension under investigation for Islamophobia, and that news hadn't been released. So there's rising concerns about Keir Starmer's leadership and what he says versus what he actually does, which is not much.
Right. Margaret, would you like to stand up for Keir Starmer?
I think this is fantasy politics, frankly, and an eminently predictable. There's a little package of criticisms about Keir that have been coming from a particular sector in the party, and it's just not in the real world. I mean, to talk about the Batley and Spen by-election without talking about the absolutely poisonous impact of the campaign that George Galloway ran, and to see people who consider themselves to be on the left, whether I would consider them to be or not is another matter, defending, associating themselves with George Galloway is profoundly shocking, because his whole campaign was absolutely poisonous.
All right, well, he's not here, but if we look at the broader issues that Moya raised, Margaret.
Fantasy politics.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't mention George Galloway, and I've not supported George Galloway. So I don't know why the inference was that I would support George Galloway in any shape or form. And I think the fantasy politics you're talking about is a world that you exist in, clearly, because on the ground, these issues keep coming up for Keir Starmer again and again. There was a poll, I think, it was by Johnson & Johnson, which looked at the Red Wall voters. And the number one reason Red Wall voters said that they were moving away from the party long after the former leader had left was Keir Starmer. So I think maybe you should get back in the real world.
Margaret?
Yeah, I mean, I really do. I maintain my point of view that this is fantasy politics. It ignores the fact. It goes through an eminently predictable, an identical set of criticisms of Keir, it's just living in another world.
You haven't refuted any of these criticisms. You've pointed out the criticisms, which they are, so thank you for that. But you haven't actually refuted them. What does Keir Starmer stand for?
We know very clearly what Keir stands for, and one of the things that I think summarises it best is a phrase that I've heard him use more than once, which is he wants to make this the best country to grow up in and the best country to grow old in. And he's talked about jobs, about homes, about problems in education, about skills, about a whole range of things. And because of the pandemic, it hasn't cut through. I'll give you, if you want a comparison, I'll give you a comparison that's very germane to today. In my opinion, Keir Starmer is our Gareth Southgate. He's an adult.
Christ.
He's grown up. He's grown up. He's living in the real world. He's getting a whole lot of often insults. He's getting a whole lot of advice, which is utterly superfluous and irrelevant. And he's carrying on a steady course because that's what he has to do.
I'll give you a comparison. Keir Starmer's Unite Emery.
Do you not think, though, Moya, that Margaret's point about Keir Starmer having to operate in a pandemic, you mentioned it yourself, has made it difficult? Have you noticed any change since you haven't changed your mind, that's clear, but have you noticed any change in the way that he is performing at Prime Minister's Questions, for example? He's had a change of the leadership at the top in his office. Is that showing a different Keir Starmer?
Well, I don't think I have noticed much change because Keir Starmer is somebody who I don't think does cut through, even at PMQs. You know, he performs well at PMQs. He has from the start because he's a good speaker in that environment. But it's not Prime Minister's Questions that is going to win Labour back lost members of the electorate. And it's also what they're doing as well as alienating the bases that are still with them. So, you know, I've heard a lot from demographics of colour, like marginalised communities such as the Muslim community, such as black voters who support Labour, who say they feel alienated by what they perceive as being taken for granted by Labour. And they're not switching to the Tories but they're just not voting or choosing that they don't want to actively support Labour anymore. I think that's a cause for concern. Right,
well, Margaret and even Angela Rayner, the deputy leader, implied that people didn't know after Hartlepool what he stood for.
Well, you know, people make a whole lot of observations, and both Hartlepool and Batley were unusual by-elections with real problems, most of which were, for us, most of which were ignored. For example, in Hartlepool, I hardly saw mention of the fact that the Member of Parliament, who was lucky to win in 2019 because of the way the vote split with Brexit, actually had to stand down because of accusations of sexual harassment. Nobody mentioned that much in the public conversations, but you can bet nobody in Hartlepool forgot it and that it was taken into account. So I think, you know, you have to look at these things in the round, and you have to see what is their significance as you go along. The significance of Batley and Spen is that we held on to that seat despite all the worst of what could be thrown at us.
All right.
And you know, for Kim Leadbitter, I thought for her to be pursued and harassed and attacked in the way she was, in the very streets where her sister was murdered only a few years ago, I thought it was absolutely despicable. And, you know, holding on to that seat was a real achievement and a real triumph. And, you know, things have gone back to more or less normal. It's not a massive, overwhelming victory, but I won my seat that I hold now for the first time by 421 votes. That was in 1983.
It takes back a bit of history. He's like Gareth Southgate, Harry.
No, he's not like Gareth Southgate. He's Ed Miliband with a law degree. This is the problem for Labour. Look, there's this whole argument there that they're having playing out in front of in front of the nation. The nation isn't listening. They're just bickering amongst themselves. On the left, you've got Keir Starmer being attacked for not being Corbyn, basically, and the right, they realise he's not, he's not as good as they think he is. He's not cut through it. Yes, he's had a tough year with the pandemic, but I still think he could be doing that. He could be legions ahead. I think Labour probably still have some way to go before they reach rock bottom in terms of the electoral map.
All right.
If Hartlepool's ending to go by, and I just think they're never going to get rid of him though, because the worst thing they fear is fear of something else.
That's it. That's all we have time for. Goodbye from all of us.